Well, hello everyone. Sorry about that. I turned on the wrong audio, but I got there in the end. That's the important thing. Hello, it is Kristi. It is Sunday, and so it is time for a little bit of Social Science Sunday. Yeah, let's get going on. We're going to talk about a very common and popular form of analysis used in oftentimes international relations. In political science, I'm sure there are other case studies as well from other disciplines, but that's the one that I know best. And we're going to be talking about qualitative comparative methods. I'm also kind of organizing the window a little bit on the fly because I had to reset everything up. I think that's okay. It's a little. I want Lava Lamp to have enough prominence in the screen. So I know people like Lava Lamp, as do I, which is why I got Lava Lamp. But let's just, change this up a little bit so it's a bit easier to see, and we'll get going. All right, let's talk about qualitative research and comparative methods. I'm going to just start. So this, as I said before, it's often used in the study of international relations. Hold on, I'm going to mute my mic and set up for a quick second here. That's better. It is often associated with a positivist epistemology, although the logic of comparative method could be used either inductively or deductively. We'll see that, we're going to be focusing on cases where it's a little bit harder, like, you don't have necessarily enough cases to be able to do a statistically generalizable quantitative study. Now, the logic of comparative methods is, I'm a little bit loud. I'm going to back that up again a bit. It's similar to what drives the attempt to control for other explanations when you conduct an experiment. But the crucial difference is that comparative methods are used when you have insufficient cases to have a statistical method. Remember, the point of a statistical analysis is to be able to generalize about a population. And when you have, let's say, where there are like 208 or 217 countries in the world, if you wanted to do studies to generalize about those 208 countries, if it's maybe on things that people have in common, like health outcomes, you can do it. You can do a global, global data analysis and then use country, location, or region as some sort of proxy to compare. But if you want to compare democracy to an authoritarian form of government, you just kind of don't have the statistical abilities to do that because the sample sizes are pretty small. Oftentimes, comparative method is a first stage of research where you're doing the important work of theory generation. You're looking inductively at the world and trying to understand what the causal relationships are that are producing these outcomes. And once you have done some preliminary investigation inductively, understanding that you can have spurious induction, then you can formulate hypotheses about a causal relationship between phenomenon and make a prediction and move on to statistical analysis. But, qualitative comparative methods was around long before we had modern statistical probability theory developed about representativeness and generalizability and the kind of levels of tolerance we have for error. Like that was also a result of pushing methods forwards, like theory had to keep up. And so when we talk about like John Stuart Mill and stuff, he didn't have access to that kind of stuff. So the thing about case studies is you have to decide, like, what is your question? Right? What is my question? What's my answer? Why should you believe me? Why should you care? What is my question is going to come down to, what am I comparing in doing comparative analysis? If you don't have a good idea of the exact thing or exact ways in which you want to compare things, you're just going to end up collecting a lot of random data. Or you might start off with thinking you're going to go in one direction and then end up actually going in a different one. So there's some fancy words coming up here, but they're pretty obvious once they're explained. So you can either do synchronic or diachronic comparisons. If you're comparing cases across countries or across groups at the same time point, in quants, we would call this a cross-section. You're doing a little snapshot of a population at a single point in time. All polling, usually that's put out. I mean, there are some panels where they ask the same people over the course of an election, but for example, all of the polling data that you see put out are generally cross-sectional. They go back to a new group each time. But everyone gets asked within a certain time window, right, in order to be comparable, that they're all getting the same kind of media influences or whatever else at the same time. So that's a synchronic comparison, or within one time point across groups. You could also compare a single case over time. We would call that in political behavior or panel study, anything where you have individuals over time, longitudinal or diachronic over time. So those are two ways to think about it. Oftentimes, your comparative analysis will focus on a particular set of questions, for instance, countries. Your statistical techniques might not be applicable because you don't have enough cases, and you want to provide enough information about the different countries that are useful for comparison. And there are some ways to do, like maybe some t-tests or other like low-level tests where you can try to test a hypothesis, but you start to get into like small n statistics, and I know that there are ways to do small n analysis with country codes, but we're not going to do that because we're focusing on qual here. We're going to look at, what criteria on which should we compare people. So let me just say hi. I see people in the chat. Let me say hello. I don't know where y'all went. I can't see my chat window. Is it hiding behind? Where's my chat window? My chat window disappeared. I can see y'all on the screen, but I can't see y'all in the well, I hope you're having fun. I can't see. I messed up. I can't see the chat today for some reason. So I hope you all are doing well. Hi. Good to see you here. Thanks for stopping by. Actually, what I might do is minimize this a bit, and make this a little bit bigger. Oh, there we go. And then make y'all a little bit bigger, so I can see a bit better afterwards when it's too late. Right. Okay, let's see. Now, can I restore the chat and still see it? Oh, yeah, all right. Friendly Boop, hello. Cross-stitch project, no worries. That sounds cool. I would like to see a picture of that, DN fan. And Easy7, hello, and thank you all for stopping by. I know it's early in the morning or late at night, depending on where you are, so I always appreciate you stopping by to spend some time with me and be nerdy. All right, J.S. Mill, very famous British philosopher, political activist, early suffragette, just generally, not one of the worst white guys that's ever lived, which really puts him in an elite crowd when you look back in history. But he came up with a very sensible way of thinking about modes of analysis, and he tried to be practical. I think most people would know him probably from like utilitarianism. And Mill was, and he had a father who was also, I think, a very famous philosopher, very rigorous thinker. Made a lot of good intellectual contributions. But he stated that ways that you can understand different cases is you can approach it from a method of agreement. You can study similar cases in order to find out what they have in common that produce this outcome. Again, remember, this is like before proper statistical techniques. We're talking the 1800s. Or looking at the method of difference, the study of contrasting cases in order to find what is it about them that makes them different. So in the first one, the most similar systems design, the idea is that we want to sample on characteristics that are as similar as possible in as many respects, except for the one that you think might be the important causal variable. Let's see. The problem with this is that I'm not naturally a comparative politics person, so it's a little bit hard for me sometimes to come up with really good examples off the top of my head of political. Yeah, I'm still futzing with the screen. Sorry, I should have done that beforehand. I need my coffee. Hold on. I'm going to get my coffee and come right back. right, and I'm back. And I absolutely had to make sure I turned the camera off because I am not wearing pants. So I had to make sure nobody saw my undies. All right. Yes, systems that are similar in every respect except for the variable you might think is causal variable of importance. Ideally, of course, nothing should differ except the explanatory cause that we're interested in. That's sometimes in comparative politics, I think, pretty hard to do, but you make your efforts, right? You do, look, at this point, politics, the way you think about it is that it's a naturally occurring experiment all the time. And so you try to optimize the real world, even if you don't have ideal cases. So that's the most similar system, is find all these things on which countries are the same. And then if you try to find the causal thing that is different. Now, for the most different systems design, that is taking a complete opposite approach. The idea here is to get examples that are as different as possible on every characteristic, except the variable of interest, except the thing that you want to investigate as the causal driver. Now, the interesting thing, so think about this, like the logic of it. On the one hand, we would probably be more familiar with the idea of a most similar system was one because of the way we think about experimental psychology, which is to try to control for all those things and isolate the one causal variable. And this is doing a mirror opposite. It's taking the causal variable and it's trying to exclude other possible explanations by looking for other sources of variation that could account for it besides the causal link in two different, very different cases. Comparative methods and case study methods. It's a case study because we looked at case study last week, right? And we looked at trying to get an example of case studies of discourse around anti-feminist principles at 3 key time points in order to compare values, language, attitudes, opinions at 3 crucial time points in anti-feminist rhetoric activism. Case studies are also very useful for comparative methods on the international level because, again, sample size is a problem. Also because countries are quite, unique and have a lot of interesting factors within them. And so that has to be evaluated in the cause of doing your comparative analysis. So this intense study of 1 or 2 cases, such as countries, can provide context and a better cultural or institutional framework than just trying to homogenize a bunch of variation across countries with a one-size-fits-all model. Now, I think it is worth saying here, because I know the flaws of, the weaknesses or the critiques one could level at statistical analysis. But recall that the point of statistical analysis is not to give you a case-by-case, study-by-study answer for every person. You're bunging a whole bunch of people in, and you're trying to find a model that best fits the error in that group. So that's a hoity-toity. Okay, so because people, or let's say countries in your group, vary on quite a lot of things, your extreme cases, depending on what you want to do with outliers, or the way things are clumped up in terms of factors on which people have things in common in your group, all of that's going to get. All that variation, all that variegation is going to get just become, error terms. And the model that you end up with, if you end up with like a homogeneous one-size-fits-all model, it will explain factors in a population, but it won't tell you a lot about a person. And that's why a case study where you can talk about, for maybe the institutional cultural backgrounds that account for why people think about things in a certain way. It's going to capture that kind of uniqueness far better than a one-size-fits-all model. Okay. Keeping going down. Now, Lippard identifies 6 ideal types, and ideal types, we're getting back here to Weber. The notion of an ideal type is not something that you can actually find in the real world, but it's your outline of exactly what would be the perfect example of a thing. So it's like, I don't want to say it's like Plato and the forms, but in a kind of way, it's that sort of aspirational notion of a perfected thing that can't exist in the real world because the real world doesn't look like that. And so he identifies 6 different ideal types of case study that you can apply. One is an atheoretical case study. If something is completely new or under-researched, then merely describing it, documenting it, and publishing it to the wider audience of academic researchers and the public itself is a contribution. You might not think about it in that way, but like going to the moon, and you go up and you just like describe the moon and you say what it's like the first time you're there, you need that descriptive analysis before you can start doing causal analysis. And so descriptive analysis, I think, tends to get a bit of a short shrift. People want to know more about inferential statistics or causal relationships. But for, again, underserved or under-researched populations or groups, merely describing them and putting them into the discourse is itself is a massive contribution to the body of knowledge, because it didn't exist before. You're putting in new information as opposed to rehashing stuff we already know about. Interpretive case study is selected for analysis due to an interest in that particular case. So you might want to look at a unique case and then generalize from that. Let's just take an example. What were the steps in the first 4 countries that achieved marriage equality? Perhaps you can look at some of the early adopters of marriage equality and look for things that they had in common. Like, what were the other characteristics of these countries that set them apart from other countries in the world? Or was it just happenstance, that a country ended up achieving marriage equality early on? And you can also, third case is a hypothesis-generating case study. Your goal is to inductively investigate a case study to produce a theoretical framework to test variables quantitatively. For instance, you might have a descriptive analysis of the first 5 countries that achieved marriage equality, and then you can go back later and try to do a more of a hypothesis-generating case study in order to identify those factors that they had in common that might help us account for why they were the first to achieve marriage equality. There are also theory-confirming case studies. Everyone knows you can find confirmation of a theory if you go look for it. So, yeah, you're probably going to get a hard time on this one. But moving on, theories infirming cases. Now, both of these involve application of a generalized theory to a specific instance. Theory confirming are cases which affirm the proposition. Theory infirming weaken the generalizations. But if you have, I think if you go out and you find something that allies with a previous theory and you're wanting to confirm a theory, I think this day and age would be kind of difficult to get that through peer review. I think it'd probably be more interesting and more likely to get published if you try to weaken a generalization of a theory by looking at case studies. Again, because it's just this criticism of you can always find things to confirm a theory you believe in. That I think, but I don't know. I don't do comparative politics. Maybe people do that quite a lot in their analysis. And finally, deviant case studies. This is a case that goes against the generalizations. It deviates from the theoretical expectations, and you want to isolate, ideally, the causal structures and explanations that allow you to understand how this deviant case ended up being as deviant as it is. All right, Carbo and Beasley examine comparative case studies on the individual level as opposed to the aggregate level, where one nation is used as one case. They talk about a comparative case study is a systematic comparison of 2 or more data points obtained through the use of the case study method. They go on to write that the case study, in other words, often uses a number of techniques for gathering information, from interviews to surveys to content analysis, but it is not necessarily necessary to use multiple sources or types of evidence in order to perform a case study. We feel that case studies can be very qualitative and narrative in form, and they can be very quantitative and analytic in form. And that's true. It depends on the approach you want to take and whether or not you want to do inductive or deductive or a retroductive where you're going back and forth. So they recommend doing case studies with a structured, focused comparison method. Structured because the research is guided by general questions, and focused because it deals with specific issues or aspects of the historical case. Now, as the authors note, these steps should sound familiar in terms of how to do your comparative analysis. Good general principles of research design 1, logical thinking, 2, common sense, and 3, rigor in your design strategy. So they recommend identifying specific research questions for focused comparison. What is my question? How and why will focus on processes. If you want to understand what or who, you'll be identifying a class of phenomenon. Step 2, identify your variables from existing theory. What factors have been hypothesized to explain this? Be explicit in the factors that you're using to predict or think that are most important in explaining your phenomenon of interest. Then once you have that pretty clear in your head, you can move on to how to do a case selection. You might have a population of, let's say, countries that score above the median on the democracy scale. And I think there's a couple different democracy scales. Let's say any country that scores at the median or above can say, okay, we're going to use this for my sample, and I'm going to randomly sample from these. You can think of how to control for other effects. For instance, the effect of a parliamentary system versus like the U.S. federal system. I don't know what that was. Because obviously the way laws are enacted and the role of the president is not identical to that of the prime minister, and so there might be some things that you would want to identify as being perhaps not one-to-one. And so how do you control for that? You want, of course, comparable cases. You want cases that vary on the dependent variable. And you want cases across subgroups of the population to address alternative explanations. And getting back to our marriage equality issue, since we just picked that up I made that up as my random example. Sorry. Right, you would want to, let's say, you might have two populations here. You want to have people or those countries that have achieved marriage equality by 2020, say, and those countries that have not achieved marriage equality by 2020. And you want to do a random selection of 5 countries within each sample population with an eye for the fact that if you end up through your random sample only getting parliamentary governments or only getting PR governments, then you might have to sample a couple other ones just to control for the fact that if you only have PR systems in your sample, you can't say anything about federal, first past the post countries. All right, so thinking a little bit about what it would take to be convincing in terms of your data analysis. If you're doing comparable cases, the cases that are as similar as possible, you want to minimize the number of explanatory variables. So you can take away the idea of, democracy, and you're going to have some sort of rule of law assumption, right, versus authoritarianism. You want comparability depending on the theoretical basis, what's relevant and irrelevant to your theory. If the form of government, if it's all about the legal structures and the legal history, then it kind of doesn't matter if you have a PR system or a first past the post system. Rather, you're looking at what legal precedents existed or were argued to expand or remain or exclusionary of marriage equality, for instance. So I'm just saying that you don't have to do everything through government. If you want to look at law, then maybe the form of government isn't even relevant as to how marriage equality is successful or, gets advanced inside countries, and cases should be selected in an attempt to control for known or suspected alternative causes of the relationship you are investigating. Okay, so you're just being rigorous again. If you have cases that vary on the dependent variable, that case selection should allow, so that when the independent variable, just comparable cases. All right, so if you're looking for countries, then the dependent variable is the thing that we want to explain. It's our why. And the question we're going to take is, what are the factors in common in countries that have achieved marriage equality by 2020? So we'll want to look for variation in the values of the dependent variable, because if that's the case, then without variation in the dependent variable, we can't make causal inferences. If, the default was, marriage equality wasn't the case, and so we didn't have to explain that because it was always like that. Right. So we want to be able, so it's different as some countries have marriage equality and some don't. And that's the thing that we want to explain. So we need some, cases of countries where it isn't that might be very similar to the ones where it is, and understand, considering that these two countries are pretty close to being the same, why is it they haven't achieved marriage equality yet? All right. This is just getting really like, I don't really like comparative studies. It's not that I don't like it. It's just, it's not my groove. It's not my jam. But we're coming to the end. We're getting really close to the end of this, and then I'll have a look at some of your comments because I haven't been able to see anything. You know what? Let's take a little pause because Kristi's getting bored. So let's see what people are saying in the chat. All right. Sleepy but here. You finished the cross stitch. Oh, DN fan, you should totally post that in the Discord. I would love to see how that turned out for you. Are y'all being very quiet today? So we'll definitely keep things moving here. Cases based on variation in the explanatory variable. This is the one that where you have you've selected cases based on the thing that you think is causing the change. You want to look at the relationship, for instance, between stress and the quality of decision making. You can select cases where stress was present, very high, select cases where stress was very low, and then investigate how these independent variables related to the quality of decision making. Cases based on variation in the values of the dependent variable. I think you got to get the idea of that. It's really just comparing things. That's really what it comes down to. If you have cases across a subgroup of a population, you have to choose cases with an alternative explanation in mind. Again, always anticipate the second reviewer. Always anticipate reviewer number 2, who is going to have, but actually, you want to take into consideration cases that include variation across some dimension associated with an alternative explanation. Perhaps religiosity is something that you'll want to, compare countries with high levels of religious adherence and countries with low levels of religious adherence, and whether or not that makes a difference to marriage equality, because obviously the United States would be quite an exception in that case. Attempts to demonstrate the relationship that holds across different subgroups of a population, and you might want to try to provide a rationale to resist assertion of provides a rationale to resist assertion of an alternative explanation for the same phenomenon. Step 4, you want to operationalize your variables and construct a case codebook. You want to record and report the way your data were collected. You want to declare in advance what's necessary for your evidence to be coded in a particular way. And you might have to go through, do some grounded theory, open coding, go to the data, look to see what emerges, start to clump things together. And then at the end of the process, when you have a better idea of the underlying structures, then you can go back to the beginning and just review with fresh eyes that whether or not there are some things that you missed initially when in the discovery of the structures without actually, and then go back and apply it to those early data. And your pilot studies might be necessary to refine your concepts. Again, it's not a one and done. Qualitative is iterative, over and over and over. Eventually it ends, but step 5, you want your code right cases. Narrative study case analysis, you can write up a narrative structure using that to explain what is my question, what is my answer, why should you believe me, why should you care. This allows you as a researcher to show your variables that you've selected in the context that is important to understanding the relationships, the causal relationships you are investigating. It demonstrates realism and temporal progression, and any uncertainty on the part of the analyst should also be presented. You don't have to know everything. You can say, well, it kind of measures it. I mean, it's better than nothing. It's better than what we had before. I mean, you don't say that in the article, but, we have academic ways of saying that. And then you'll want to do comparison and implications for your theory. So you're looking for patterns within and across cases. If you want to practice congruence procedure, you will determine whether any of your independent variables differ across the outcomes of the dependent variable. There's also pattern matching. A single predicted pattern is compared to the pattern observed in the cases. So you have a general theory of prediction of how things are going to relate, and then you look case by case. Or you can have mutually exclusive rival patterns that you compare for their consistency with the pattern in your observed cases. So you're trying to basically, like devil's advocate, to look to see which of these 2 or 3 other possible explanations can explain your outcome. Ideally, you want it to be very difficult to use another explanation to explain your outcome, but that doesn't mean that look, when it comes to the social reality, the world in a lot of ways is one big endogenous mess, and you want to cover your bases by not asserting a spurious relationship. In other words, if the point of this is theory generation, then identifying control variables so you can isolate your theory of interest or your theoretical relationship of interest is important to do at a qualitative or inductive case level, because you don't want to go out and miss something that could also be driving the outcome you're interested in. Go ahead, operationalize everything, do all your statistical work, gather your data, do your statistical analysis, and then a reviewer comes back and say, well, did you control for, variable Z? And then you go back and you put it into your data set, and then the relationship basically, it might just drop a lot in significance, or your other thing might explain it better. So that kind of skepticism about the completeness of a single theory is generally a good thing to keep in mind when you're a social scientist, because things are complicated, and it's better, I think, in my opinion, to represent the complexities and wrestle with them than to oversimplify them in order to get a model efficiency. Model efficiency isn't reality. Reality is reality. And that's it, really. Oh, we blew through this. Really got through it quick because it's so boring. No, it's not that boring, but it's just, like I said, it's not my most favorite way of doing political analysis. So we've blown through this. I guess we're going to have an early week. We're going to be able to take a little extra time off and have some time free. So that's going to be fun. I'm going to just sip my coffee for just a quick second. Let's see what we've got on the docket for next week in our list. So we've got qualitative research and comparative methods. Okay. Oh, there's an example. Okay, here we go. We'll finish this next one so that we can get to the art of listening for next week. Now, I've not read this or looked at it in any meaningful way, so I will have to look to see. All right, comparative qualitative method example. Excellent. This, I think, yeah, it looks fine on the screen. You all can see that. So, De Schweiznitz asked in 1964, how may economic growth, which is a process by which an economy passes from a subsistence to a high-income status economy, democratize political systems which are initially undemocratic? What is the explanatory or causal variable, and what is the dependent or affected variable? He is comparing historical experiences with economic developments and democratization in Britain, the US, Germany, and Russia. So let's look at his categories of analysis. Now, you might have a hard time kind of seeing this because it is very, 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 very tiny. So tiny. Tiny, tiny. I don't think making this bigger makes no difference whatsoever. No, makes no difference whatsoever. All right, so I'll just explain the categories. You know, it's Britain, United States, Germany, Russia. He has as his comparative elements character of economic development, unique feature, social class development, political culture, and outcome. So let's look at the metric of character of economic development. For Britain, it's early autonomous economic development, US, autonomous economic development, Germany, late industrialization, partly state-led, and Russia, late industrialization, not autonomous. What is their unique feature? Britain is isolated geographically, peaceful for the last half-century. The United States has space, climate, natural resources, and no feudal past. But a slave past and an oppression past, which isn't mentioned here, freaking white men and their biases and their whitewashing of history. Germany was a heavyweight of history, strong centralized state, and Russia was limited access to natural resources, a centralized state, and persistence of serfdom. So you're going to mention serfdom, but you're not going to mention, like slavery and its legacy that they had. White people BS. All right. Social class development. Britain has a large middle class, strong labor movement, The United States has a large middle class with a weak labor movement. Germany has a large but alienated middle class, but a strong labor movement. And Russia has no large middle class and a small working class. In terms of its political culture, Britain is characterized as liberal individualism, the United States as rugged individualism. Germany lacks individualism, again, this bias. And Russia is Marxist ideology, which, honestly, dude, this has nothing to do with individualism. Ugh, these 1960s stuff. Oh, it's so terrible. All right. The outcome was democracy. Okay. I mean, colonialism, but democracy. U.S. democracy, yeah. White men domined everything basically until like the 1960s. And that's, that's a pretty broad category of democracy. Germany's an unstable democracy, and Russia, no democracy. So even though it's a case study, you can completely see the white male European bent normative framework and values being smuggled into this. And that's just annoying. All right. Qualitative comparison of these three countries allows him to concentrate on the historical sequence and factors unique to each case. Of course, those historical sequences are going to be biased based on the framing, we should note. Draw inference about the relationship between development and democracy, when you count democracy as being white people. Find that the key obstacles to successful democratization are late development and state-centered growth. Yeah, that was not at all a capitalist biased 1960s worldview. And Schweitz, or whatever his name was, concluded that the Euro-American route to democracy is closed and that countries developing in the 20th century must find other means for establishing democratic institutions. Oh, you mean that the colonization of an entire continent where its economic growth was built on slavery, stolen lands, and exploitation, and putting native peoples into basically like geographic concentration camps can't be done by other countries? Ah, well, okay. Morset extends a comparison to a larger set of countries, seeking to understand the relationship between economic development and political forms through a few comparing countries to serve as a rough negative check on historical explanations, and it might lead to new historical generalizations. Like de Schweinitz, Moore thinks political outcomes are the products of discrete, that means separate, historical configurations that might not be able to be repeated. All right, so with this, you get now three different categories of nations: Britain, France, India, and the United States. Number 2 is Germany, Italy, and Japan. And number 3 is Russia and China. So we have different categories here of analysis: the character of economic development, class development and conditions, the role of the state, and the final outcome. So in category 1 of character of economic development, you get development of commercial agriculture. Then in Japan, Italy, and Germany, you get development of commercial agriculture. But in Russia and China, you get no development. That's not to say there isn't agriculture, but there isn't extensive commercial agriculture. Class development and conditions: Britain, France, US, and India, weakening of landed aristocracy, balance of power, the crown and the landed aristocracy, but that doesn't quite happen in the US, and the absence of an aristocratic bourgeois coalition against the peasants and the workers. In comparison to Group 2, Germany, Italy, and Japan, they had a strong land-owning class and a coalition of powerful land-owning class and a weak dependent bourgeoisie. Whereas in Russia and China, it was a strong land-owning class, a weak bourgeoisie, and mass peasantry with a capacity for collective action. The role of the state in Britain, France, India, and the U.S. was revolutionary and a violent break with the past. Britain did have, France had a revolution, the United States had a revolution, India, I don't know if you call it a revolution per se, but they definitely were campaigning against the overthrow. Yeah, I guess you could call it a revolution, although I haven't heard that used a lot to describe it. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, there was a strong state, trade protection, managed industrialization, and controlled labor. And in Russia and China, there was a centralized state and a labor repression. The outcomes was you get capitalist parliamentary democracy in categories 1, capitalist fascism in category 2, and communism in category 3. Now, is this a little bit of... Yeah, okay. All right, so based on his case study, he refers 3 routes to the modern world: bourgeois revolutions and democracy, revolution from above and fascism, or revolution from below and communism. Is that convincing? Yeah, there are some things going on there. I think it's still open to critique. I think there's a lot lacking in intersectional analysis there about internal repression or colonialism as repression, but it was probably better than the 1960s one. I will give it that. All right, next time, and this is going to be, this is actually one of my more favorite lectures. We're going to be looking at qualitative research in the art of listening, because there is a thing about doing qualitative research that if you don't have the right, if you're listening, the whole point of doing textual analysis based on words people have said is to obtain those words in their own words and what they've, what people do, think, and say. If you can't really hear what someone is saying in the moment because you're too busy thinking about your next question, or you're too busy thinking about something else, a phone call you had, a fight you had, you're not really present to catch what they're saying and to identify points where you can intervene and say, can you expand on that a little bit? Or tell me a little bit more about why you picked this phrase? Or what does that mean to you exactly? In order to do good qualitative research, you have to be a good listener. And being a good listener is a skill. And next time we're going to look at the art of listening. There's a little poem. I'm going to say it next time too. His thoughts were slow, his words were few, and never made to glisten. But he was a joy wherever he went. You should have heard him listen. All right. And on that, I'm going to just check the chat one more time. Was dinner good? I hope so. 2007 feels incredibly out of date. Yeah. 1964. Yes, Sib. So out of date. All right, y'all. Class is ending 15 minutes early. You can use this time to go enjoy the weather or the evening, the day, the night, wherever it is. And if you don't have anything else to do, in a couple hours' time, you can always join me and my friends over on Twitch at the Rolling Left channel. We're going to be doing some doing a Candlekeep mystery tonight. Trying to keep it on the down low so that my players don't find out what we're doing. But if you want to come over and be nerdy, otherwise, if you want to wait for a week, I will be back next Sunday with the art of listening and qualitative research. I look forward to seeing you then. Oh, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Have a great and wonderful day, afternoon, evening, wherever it is, whenever it is you are. Be happy, be healthy, and be well until we see each other again. Okay. Bye.